$350,000. That's what the HOA president demanded I could pay for violations on property I've owned for 30 years. She stood on my porch, smirking, flanked by her board members like some kind of suburban mafia. What she didn't know, what nobody in that fancy neighborhood knew, was that their million-dollar homes, their pristine lawns, their community pool, and their precious clubhouse were all built on MY land. And I had the deed to prove it. My name is Marcus Henderson, and this story begins not with anger, but with love. My grandfather, William Henderson, was what you'd call a quiet man with a loud legacy. He came to this country in 1952 with nothing but $12 and a dream that his children would never know the hunger he'd experienced. Over the next 4 decades, he worked 3 jobs, saved every penny, and slowly acquired land in what was then considered the middle of nowhere, a rural stretch of Georgia that nobody wanted. By the time he passed in 1994, Grandpa William had accumulated just over 200 acres of undeveloped land. Most people laughed at his investment. What's he going to do with all that empty land? They'd ask. But Grandpa William just smiled. He knew something they didn't. He knew that cities expand. He knew that one day, that worthless land would be worth its weight in gold. When he died, the land passed to my mother, and when she passed in 2015, it came to me. I was 42 years old, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start. Moving from Chicago to Georgia to manage my inheritance felt like the universe giving me exactly what I needed. Here's the thing about my grandfather's land that everyone seemed to have forgotten. It wasn't all in one piece. He'd bought parcels over the years as they became available, creating a patchwork quilt of ownership across what would eventually become Fulton County's most desirable suburban area. Most of it was developed. My family had sold or leased various parcels over the decades. But there was one specific 12-acre parcel that had remained completely untouched and, apparently, completely forgotten, except by me. That 12-acre parcel sat at the edge of what was now known as Clearwater Estates, a gated community of 147 homes, each valued between $800,000 and $2.5 million. These weren't just houses, they were statements. Manicured lawns that looked painted green, matching mailboxes, rules about what color you could paint your shutters. The whole 9 yards of HOA nonsense. My parcel wasn't inside Clearwater Estates. It bordered the back of the development, separated by a tree line that my grandfather had planted himself in 1978. On my land sat an old farmhouse that my grandfather had built with his own hands, a barn that was somehow still standing despite decades of neglect, and a small pond that was home to an impressive collection of frogs and the occasional deer family. I moved into that farmhouse in the spring of 2018. It needed work, a lot of work, but it was mine. More importantly, it was quiet. No more honking horns. No more sirens at 3 a.m. No more neighbors fighting through paper-thin apartment walls. Just me, the frogs, and the sound of wind through trees my grandfather had planted before I was born. For the first 6 months, everything was peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the farmhouse, clearing brush, and learning how to be alone without being lonely. I raised chickens. I grew vegetables. I even considered getting a goat, though that plan was abandoned when I realized I knew absolutely nothing about goats. Then, in November of 2018, I met Patricia Wellington. She arrived on a Saturday morning, driving a white Mercedes SUV that probably cost more than my entire farmhouse. She was accompanied by 2 men in khaki pants and polo shirts, the unofficial uniform of HOA board members everywhere. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that's really just condescension wearing a smile. "I'm Patricia Wellington, president of the Clearwater Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk." I wiped the dirt from my hands. I've been planting winter vegetables, and walked over to meet them. "Marcus Henderson, what can I do for you?" She handed me an envelope. "This is a formal notice of violations. We've documented 17 separate infractions on this property." I opened the envelope, my confusion growing with each line I read. The violations included unpainted fence, my grandfather's wooden fence, excessive vegetation, the trees my grandfather planted, visible storage of farm equipment, my tractor, unauthorized livestock, my chickens, and, I kid you not, dwelling not in accordance with community aesthetic standards. Ma'am, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, I don't live in your community. This is private property that's been in my family for over 60 years. Patricia's smile didn't waver. I understand that you're new here, Mr. Henderson, but Clearwater Estates maintains certain standards for all adjacent properties. Your situation is affecting property values throughout our community. Adjacent properties? I repeated, you have no jurisdiction over my land. That's where you're wrong, she said, still smiling. Our covenant covers all properties within the original development zone. You'll need to bring your property into compliance within 30 days, or we'll be forced to pursue legal action. She turned on her heel and walked back to her Mercedes, leaving me standing there with a list of violations that made absolutely no sense. I should have taken it more seriously. I should have hired a lawyer that very day. Instead, I laughed it off. I assumed it was some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding that would sort itself out once someone in authority realized their HOA had no power over me. That assumption would cost me 2 years of my life and nearly everything I owned. Over the next 6 months, Patricia Wellington declared war on me and my little farmhouse. It started with letters. Certified letters, to be specific, arriving weekly like clockwork. Each one documented new violations I was supposedly committing. My chickens were too loud. My truck was too old. My mailbox was the wrong shape. I was hanging laundry outside to dry. Apparently a capital offense in the world of Patricia Wellington. I responded to each letter the same way, by throwing it in the trash. I wasn't part of their HOA. I hadn't signed any agreements. I had no intention of painting my grandfather's handmade fence or getting rid of chickens that had become my morning companions. But Patricia wasn't someone who accepted being ignored. In June of 2019, I came home from a trip to the hardware store to find 3 official-looking vehicles parked in my driveway. A man in a county uniform informed me that a complaint had been filed about code violations on my property. The subsequent inspection found that my barn was structurally questionable and that I was keeping livestock without proper permits. The permits, I would later discover, had been revoked. Not by me. I hadn't even known they existed, but by someone who had called the county claiming to be the property owner's representative and requesting that all agricultural permits be canceled. One guess who that someone was. By the time I got everything sorted out and my permits reinstated, I'd already been fined $2,500 and had been forced to temporarily relocate my chickens to a neighbor's farm. That neighbor, an elderly man named Robert who'd known my grandfather, warned me about what I was dealing with. The Wellingtons have been running things around here since that development went up in 2002, Robert told me over coffee. They've driven out 3 families that I know of. Bought their land at rock-bottom prices, too. You watch yourself. I should have listened more carefully. In September, things took a darker turn. I woke up one morning to find that the tree line separating my property from Clearwater Estates had been partially cut down. Nearly 24 trees, some of them 40 years old, had been reduced to stumps. A crew was still working when I ran out, chainsaw in hand, demanding to know what was happening. HOA authorized removal of hazardous vegetation. The crew foreman told me, showing me a work order signed by Patricia Wellington herself. This is MY property. I screamed. Those were MY trees. The foreman shrugged. Ma'am said you were a tenant. Said she had authority. By the time the police arrived, the crew had fled, leaving behind stumps and sawdust and my grandfather's legacy destroyed. The police took a report, but nothing came of it. Patricia claimed it was a misunderstanding about property lines. The tree cutting company claimed they were just following orders. Nobody was held accountable. That's when I finally hired a lawyer. James Washington was a property attorney who'd been practicing in the area for 30 years. When I showed him the stack of violation notices, the county citations, and the photos of my destroyed trees, he whistled low. They're trying to force you out, he said. It's a technique called paper terrorism. Bury someone in enough legal problems and expenses, and eventually they'll sell just to make it stop. Can they do that? They're not supposed to, he said. But HOAs have a lot of power in Georgia. The question is whether their covenant actually covers your property. We pulled the original HOA documents. The Clearwater Estates Covenant, filed in 2002 when the development was built, claimed jurisdiction over all properties within the original development zone as defined by the attached survey. The survey was the key. It showed the development zone as a neat rectangle of 150 acres. My property, according to the survey, was clearly outside that zone. I had nothing to worry about, except the survey was wrong. When James compared the HOA survey to official county records, the discrepancies were glaring. The HOA's survey showed my property as belonging to someone named Clearwater Development, LLC. The county records showed it as belonging to the Henderson family since 1976. This is fraud, James said, his voice tight. They fabricated a survey to claim your land was part of their development. Armed with this information, we filed a motion to have all HOA actions against me dismissed. It should have been straightforward. The records were clear. The fraud was obvious. But we'd underestimated how deep the Wellington influence went. The motion was dismissed by Judge Harold Patterson. We would later discover, lived in Clearwater Estates. The case was reassigned to another judge. Our appeal was denied. Legal expenses mounted. Meanwhile, the violations kept coming. Patricia claimed I was operating an illegal business. I'd sold some eggs at a farmer's market. She claimed my property was a fire hazard. I had a wood-burning stove. She claimed my pond was a mosquito breeding ground that endangered public health. The fines added up. $10,000, then $50,000, then $100,000. When the total hit $350,000, Patricia showed up personally to deliver the news. This time, she didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. Mr. Henderson, she said, you now owe Clearwater Estates $350,000 in accumulated fines and penalties. We'll be filing a lien on your property next week. Once the lien is in place, we'll begin foreclosure proceedings. She smiled, that same condescending smile she'd worn the day we met. I suggest you consider selling. I'm sure we can find a buyer who'll settle the debt and allow you to walk away with something. I watched her drive away in her white Mercedes, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about chickens or mailboxes anymore. This was about power, about someone who'd spent her life bullying people into submission and never once faced consequences. That was about to change. The breakthrough came from a most unlikely source, a cardboard box in my mother's storage unit. I've been putting off going through her things for years. The grief was still too fresh, and looking at her possessions felt like picking at a wound that hadn't healed. But with my entire inheritance on the line, I needed to find every piece of documentation that might help my case. My mother had been meticulous about paperwork. She'd inherited that trait from her father, who'd kept records of every purchase, every transaction, every legal document he'd ever signed. When I finally forced myself to go through her storage unit, I found boxes upon boxes of carefully labeled folders dating back to the 1950s. It took me 3 weeks of after-work searching to find it. The folder was labeled simply, Clearwater Creek Purchase, 1976. Inside was a deed transfer, handwritten notes, and a survey that made my heart stop. In 1976, my grandfather had purchased not just the 12 acres where my farmhouse sat. He'd purchased a total of 97 acres, a massive parcel that stretched from the current highway all the way to what was now the southern border of Clearwater Estates. And when I compared the 1976 survey to modern maps, my hands started shaking. Clearwater Estates, all 150 acres of it, sat almost entirely on land that my grandfather had purchased in 1976, land that had never been sold, land that, according to every legal document in that folder, still belonged to the Henderson family, still belonged to me. I called James Washington at 11 p.m. that night. To his credit, he answered. James, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I think I own the entire Clearwater Estates development. There was a long silence. Then, I'm going to need you to explain that. The explanation took 3 hours and 2 pots of coffee. By 2 a.m., James had gone through every document I'd found, and his face had transformed from skeptical to stunned to something that looked almost like joy. Marcus, he said, do you understand what this means? I was starting to. Here's what we pieced together. In 1976, my grandfather purchased 97 acres from a failing farm estate. The land included mineral rights, water rights, and everything in between. He paid $47,000, a fortune at the time, with a plan to eventually develop it himself. But then my grandmother got sick. The medical bills mounted. Grandpa William took on extra jobs. Development plans were shelved indefinitely. The land sat unused except for the 12 acres where he built the farmhouse. When my grandfather died in 1994, the property passed to my mother. But here's where things got complicated. My mother wasn't a businesswoman. She'd hired a property management company to handle the land, paying taxes, dealing with any issues that arose. In 2001, that property management company, Clearwater Property Services, went bankrupt, and one of its former executives, a man named Thomas Wellington, took advantage of the chaos. Thomas Wellington was Patricia's father-in-law. Using forged documents and the confusion of the bankruptcy, Thomas created a fraudulent deed showing that Clearwater Development LLC had purchased the land from my family. He then sold parcels to developers, who built the homes that now made up Clearwater Estates. The entire development, every house, every street, every blade of grass in the community garden, had been built on stolen land. My land. This is criminal fraud, James said. Multiple counts. And the statute of limitations doesn't apply to real estate fraud in Georgia if the fraud is ongoing. What about the homes? I asked. The families living there, I didn't know. They bought from the developers in good faith, James said. They'll have claims against the developers and against Clearwater Development LLC. But the land was never legally sold. Marcus, you're the rightful owner of everything. The enormity of it was overwhelming. 147 homes, a community pool, a clubhouse, tennis courts, approximately $175 million in real estate, all built on land that belonged to me. And Patricia Wellington, the woman who'd been terrorizing me for 2 years, the woman who'd fined me $350,000 for violations on my own property, lived in the biggest house in the entire development. A house that sat squarely on Henderson family land. The irony was almost too perfect. Over the next month, James and I built our case. We obtained certified copies of every relevant document. We hired forensic accountants to trace the fraudulent transactions. We found the original survey crew who'd worked on the 1976 purchase. 2 of them were still alive and willing to testify. We also discovered that Thomas Wellington had died in 2015, but not before leaving detailed records of his schemes. His widow, desperate to avoid criminal prosecution, provided us with documents that showed exactly how the fraud had been perpetrated. Patricia knew. She'd known from the moment she married into the family. And she'd been trying to drive me off my land before I could discover the truth. When we were ready, James and I walked into the county courthouse and filed a lawsuit that would become local legend. The complaint named 147 defendants, every homeowner in Clearwater Estates. It named the HOA. It named the original developers. And it named Patricia Wellington personally, alleging fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The total damages sought, $400 million. The next morning, my peaceful farmhouse was surrounded by news vans, and Patricia Wellington's white Mercedes was nowhere to be seen. The story hit the local news within hours of our filing. By the end of the week, it had gone national. Man claims he owns entire gated community after HOA harassment, read the headlines. News crews camped outside my farmhouse. Reporters called constantly. I even got a call from a producer wanting to make a documentary. But I wasn't interested in fame. I was interested in justice. The initial response from Clearwater Estates was predictable: denial. The HOA released a statement calling my claims baseless and a desperate attempt to avoid paying legitimate fines. Patricia Wellington, through her lawyer, called me a con artist and threatened to countersue. That changed quickly when the evidence started coming out. The first domino fell when the county prosecutor's office opened a criminal investigation into the original land fraud. Thomas Wellington's widow, seeking to protect herself, turned over everything she had: emails, financial records, even a handwritten confession that Thomas had never intended for anyone to see. The second domino was the title insurance companies. When the homeowners of Clearwater Estates realized they might lose their properties, they filed claims with their title insurance providers. Those companies, facing potential payouts in the hundreds of millions, launched their own investigations. What they found confirmed everything we'd alleged, and more. The third domino was the other victims. It turned out my family wasn't the only one Thomas Wellington had defrauded. Over a 30-year career, he'd stolen land from at least a dozen families, most of them elderly, most of them people of color, most of them too poor to fight back. My case became the centerpiece of a class action lawsuit that would eventually involve over 200 plaintiffs and seek damages exceeding $1 billion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 months after I filed my lawsuit, Patricia Wellington called a special meeting of the Clearwater Estates HOA. She'd convinced herself, or perhaps her lawyers had convinced her, that the homeowners would rally behind her. After all, she'd been protecting them from the undesirable living at the edge of their paradise. Surely they'd support her now. She was very, very wrong. I wasn't at that meeting, but I have friends who were. They told me it was chaos from the moment Patricia tried to speak. Homeowners who'd spent years nodding along to her dictates were now confronting her with the evidence they'd found. Their land might be taken. Their homes might be worthless. And it was all because Patricia and her family had built a community on a foundation of lies. You knew, one homeowner screamed. You knew this land was stolen, and you covered it up. You fined that man for living on his own property, another shouted. And now we might lose everything. Patricia tried to maintain control. She really did. But when a homeowner pointed out that the $350,000 in fines the HOA had levied against me might now be evidence of fraud, she finally broke. We were trying to protect you, she screamed back. If he just sold and gone away, none of this would have happened. We were trying to protect you. The meeting was adjourned when Patricia had to be escorted out by security. The HOA board voted to remove her as president that same night. The next morning, I received my first settlement offer. The developers' insurance companies offered $15 million to make the whole thing go away. I declined. They came back with $25 million. I declined again. I didn't want money. I wanted what had been taken from my family. Negotiations continued for 8 months. During that time, Patricia Wellington was arrested and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and filing false documents. Her husband, who'd inherited his father's title to Clearwater Development LLC, was charged as well. The homeowners, caught in the middle, organized their own legal representation. Most of them were good people who'd bought their homes in good faith, never suspecting the land beneath their feet was stolen. My lawyer and I agreed early on that we wouldn't seek to evict them. That wasn't what this was about. What we wanted was acknowledgement, recognition, and compensation for what had been taken. In the end, we reached a settlement that exceeded anything I'd imagined. The developers' insurance companies paid $47 million. The title insurance companies paid an additional $23 million. The Wellington family personally paid $8 million, which represented nearly everything they had. But the most important part of the settlement wasn't the money. The homeowners of Clearwater Estates agreed to recognize Henderson family ownership of the land. Going forward, every property owner would pay a small annual ground lease. Nominal, really just a few $100s, in perpetual acknowledgement that they were living on Henderson land. The HOA was dissolved. In its place, the community established a new organization with fair rules, reasonable expectations, and absolutely no power to harass neighboring property owners. And my grandfather's name was added to the community's main entrance. Clearwater Estates at Henderson Farm, the new sign read. Established 2002 on land purchased by William Henderson, 1976. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about legacy. It was about making sure that a man who'd worked 3 jobs to build something for his family would never be forgotten, would never be erased by people who thought they could steal what he'd earned. The $350,000 in fines? Dismissed. Completely wiped away. Patricia Wellington's smug smile? Gone forever. 2 years have passed since the settlement was finalized, and I still live in my grandfather's farmhouse. I've made improvements, of course. The roof is new. The plumbing works reliably. I've added solar panels that generate enough electricity to power the house and sell some back to the grid. The barn has been restored and now houses a small workshop where I build furniture in my spare time. My chickens still wake me up every morning. The frogs in the pond still sing me to sleep at night. And every evening, I sit on the porch my grandfather built and watch the sunset over land that bears his name. The settlement money, after taxes, legal fees, and various expenses, left me with more than I'd ever need for one lifetime. I could have moved anywhere, bought anything, lived like the millionaire I'd accidentally become. Instead, I started a foundation. The Henderson Family Foundation provides legal assistance to families facing HOA harassment, property fraud, and predatory development practices. In our first 2 years, we've helped over 300 families fight back against the kind of abuse that nearly destroyed me. We've also funded research into HOA reform. Did you know that in many states, HOAs have more power than local governments? They can fine you, foreclose on your home, even dictate what color you paint your front door, all without meaningful oversight or accountability. That's changing now, at least in Georgia, where our advocacy helped pass the Homeowner Protection Act of 2024. Patricia Wellington served 18 months in federal prison for her role in the fraud. Her husband served 2 years. When they got out, they moved to Florida. I hear they're living in a small apartment now. Their fortune gone, their reputation destroyed. I don't feel joy at their downfall. I really don't. Patricia was a product of a system that told her she was better than everyone else, that her comfort mattered more than other people's rights. She believed it. She acted on it. And when the consequences finally came, she had no idea how to face them. The homeowners of Clearwater Estates, or Henderson Farm at Clearwater Estates, as it's now known, have become my neighbors in the truest sense of the word. Without Patricia's influence, most of them turn out to be perfectly decent people who'd just been too afraid or too comfortable to push back against her bullying. Now we have block parties, potlucks, a community garden that I helped design using techniques my grandfather taught me decades ago. The annual Henderson Farm Festival raises money for local food banks and features a pie baking contest that has become surprisingly competitive. The new community association has exactly 2 rules: be kind to your neighbors and mind your own business. No one measures grass height. No one polices mailbox colors. And absolutely no one harasses the guy with the chickens. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Patricia had just left me alone. If she'd accepted that the man with the old farmhouse wasn't part of her kingdom and focused her attention elsewhere. She might still be living in her mansion, ruling her little fiefdom, secure in her position of petty power. But she couldn't. People like Patricia never can. They see someone who doesn't fit their vision of how things should be, and they can't rest until that person is either brought to heel or driven away. It's not really about property values or community standards. It's about control. It's about proving that they have power and you don't. What Patricia never understood, what bullies never understand, is that power isn't just about money or influence or position. Power is also about persistence, about principles, about being willing to fight for what's right even when the odds seem impossible. My grandfather understood that. He came to this country with nothing and built something that would outlast him by generations. He faced discrimination, hardship, and countless obstacles, but he never gave up. He never sold out. He never let anyone tell him he was less than he was. That's the real inheritance he left me. Not the land, though that turned out to be quite valuable. Not the money, though that changed my life. The real inheritance was the knowledge that I come from people who stand their ground. People who fight back. People who refuse to be erased. If you're watching this and you're dealing with your own Patricia Wellington, some bully who thinks they can take what's yours through intimidation and paperwork and sheer determination, I want you to know something. You can win. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. There will be moments when you want to give up, when the easier path would be to walk away and let them have their victory. I know because I felt that way too. There were nights I considered just selling the farmhouse and moving back to Chicago and never thinking about Clearwater Estates again. But I didn't, and you shouldn't either. Document everything. Find allies. Hire a good lawyer if you can afford one. And if you can't, reach out to organizations like my foundation that help people in exactly your situation. Most importantly, know your rights. Bullies count on their victims being too scared or too ignorant to fight back. Don't give them that satisfaction. And remember, sometimes the people who seem most powerful are standing on a foundation of lies. Sometimes all it takes is the right question, the right document, the right revelation to bring their whole empire crashing down. Patricia Wellington thought she owned me. Turned out I owned her entire neighborhood. Life comes at you fast sometimes. Make sure you're ready. That's my story. How a $350,000 fine turned into a $78 million settlement and a complete reversal of everything the people who tried to destroy me thought they knew. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We share stories every week about HOA nightmares, entitled neighbors, and everyday people who fought back against injustice and won. Drop a comment below telling me your wildest HOA story. I read every single one, and some of the best stories might become future videos on this channel. And if you or someone you know is dealing with HOA harassment, check the description for links to legal resources and organizations that can help. Until next time, remember, know your rights, keep your documents, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong on your own land. I'm Marcus Henderson, and this has been another story of HOA justice. See you in the next one.